Hello and welcome to our latest What Makes a Difference episode. And we're again talking about moral injury, and we are delighted to have Leo Quinlan with us. So Leo is the founder of Moral Injury, or co-founder, sorry, of Moral Injury International, and he's been supporting veterans and families of the veterans of Jadotville for the past 62 years. So Leo himself is former member, commandant of the Irish Army, and he set up was the Special Assault Group, which is a forerunner to the Irish Army Rangers. Leo has worked in various capacities within 46 different countries all around the world, and he brings wealth of expertise, knowledge in things from HR and development, human resource development, and he's worked with the EU Ascension process.
What's caught us is you have a very real and very personal experience of moral injury and the impact of it, Leo, that relates to your own family and a very real link to Jadotville yourself. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. Yes, moral injury. I suppose I better tell you where I got involved with moral injury, or my understanding of moral injury in the first place. About 2020, January 2020 to be exact, when I was interacting with the U.S. Army War College and war veterans who wanted to hear about the Battle of Jadotville in the Congo 1961, where my father commanded the Irish troops in this battle. They used the term collective moral injury and said, do you realize that Jadotville, the 155 men, are a perfect example of collective moral injury? I was asking, what is moral injury? So it was explained to me. And in military terms, and of course they did emphasize, and we always emphasize, that it's not just confined to military. You have prison services, police, people like in the NHS, or the HSE as it's called in Ireland. And in every country in the world, they have the same type of problem in all walks of life. Anyway, moral injury in the military sense, from a layman's way of explaining it, is when soldiers suffer some traumatic experience and are then betrayed by higher authority. In other words, when they come home, they're ignored. There's no duty of care. They're thrown on the scrap heap. And we know all about this in Vietnam veterans going off living in the hills on their own and so on. Now, moral injury is akin to post-traumatic stress, but there's a distinct difference. Post-traumatic stress, you can, as I understand it, you can measure it, and it's difficult to treat. Moral injury, on the other hand, is more difficult to measure because you don't really see it in people. But if it is identified, yes, probably you can treat it. Now, Moral Injury International came about as a result of discussions I had with the son of another Jadotville veteran who lives in Australia, Marty O'Connor. And others came on board as well. Michael Lyons came on board, another Irish ex-army living in Australia, not in Jadotville, no connection with Jadotville. But talking to Marty, we discovered that he had experience in moral injury in his family. And I then was talking to Jadotville veterans in Ireland, and I got their stories. When they heard about what moral injury was, they said, oh, yeah, that's me, that's my dad, and so on and so forth. So the effects of moral injury, as we have identified ourselves, or we've confirmed what we were told by the US and other veterans, is that the sufferers of moral injury go silent. They don't talk about it. They have difficulties with relationships, so you end up with a lot of broken marriages. Or if they're young men, they could never get married because they couldn't commit to anything. Abuse of alcohol, sometimes becoming a bit violent, difficulty to maintain a job, hold down a job, suicide, depression, all the bad things like that. And in the case of Jadotville, there are 5 suicides that we know of the 155 men that came back. And some people say closer to 9. Anecdotally, I'm told of 2 veterans who ended up in mental homes for a period of time. And I know lots of others who have had very unhappy marriages and broken relationships and so on and so forth. So why did that set in? Why did moral injury set in the Jadotville scenario?
So
Sorry?
I'm very conscious that some of our listeners will know of Jadotville, some won't. And I think the context for that is really important in terms of understanding why this was a moral injury.
Uh-huh.
Can you give us a brief background to Jadotville and what happened there?
Okay, brief background to Jadotville, 1961, Congo. In Africa, there was a civil war brewing there after the Belgian government handed over the Congo to the locals. And the United Nations were called in 1960. A year later, 1961, my father had a company as part of an Irish battalion out there. They were caught up in a place called Jadotville, where 155 men were surrounded by 3,500 of the enemy. The enemy were Katangese army led by mercenaries of the Second World War, French Foreign Legionnaires, wars of Korean War, and others. And they were very highly trained. Anyway, they attacked the Irish unexpectedly. It was supposed to be there to keep the peace, when all of a sudden they were attacked. There's a lot of history about why and so on. I won't go into that. But in any event, they fought for 5 days, 4 nights, 5 days, and there's a film made about it. It's on Netflix, which only shows 2 days of the battle. But anyway, in the 5 days of the battle, the Irish carried out a pretty brilliant defense, as it turns out. It's recognized worldwide as a good perimeter defense. So the Irish had 5 wounded only. The enemy had 300 dead and 750 wounded. So that's why it goes down in military history as a pretty good perimeter defense. However, a lot of these Irish men, they were boys. 2 of them were only 15 years old. 12 of them, by my reckoning, looking at the records, were about 16 years old. And the average age, if you take away the top 10, my father and a few others who were over 40, if you take away those, the average age of the rest was 18 and a half. And they were against veterans of the Second World War, Korean War, and so on. So they did very, very well. Unfortunately, when they came back, they were ignored. They were hailed as heroes first and then ignored afterwards. And there's reasons for that, which, we won't bother going into, I suppose. So the very fact that they were ignored when they came back and they were suffering because they did things at 15, 16, 17 years of age that went against their religious upbringing, killing people, went against the mission that were there. They were to keep the peace, not to be killing people. Went against their family upbringing. And the fact that they were ignored thereafter with no duty of care, moral injury set in. What have we done wrong? Why are we being ignored? Why are the medals that were recommended by my father and other officers, why were they never given? And so they were kind of consigned to the background all the time. And moral injury set in. And of course, we didn't know about moral injury until maybe 55, 56 years later. And so that's a kind of a short synopsis of the background of Jadotville and why moral injury set in with these veterans.
So I think from the conversations that we've had and the research we've done as well in terms of moral injury, there is that inner conflict of values and beliefs against action. And that then leads to that fracturing of your sense of who you are. It can be a sense of value, a sense of worth, a sense of identity within there where you just can't align all the pieces. And if that's also there with that institutional betrayal, then that impacts further in terms of that sense of worth, the sense of rightness of the actions, the sense of support that you would anticipate you get that you don't, which is that further layer of injury on top of that. And it does make it a very different type of injury from what people would traditionally view as PTSD or CPTSD.
Yes, I agree totally, Ali. There's the way it's put here in the Irish context, I suppose, because we're supposed to be a little bit religious, Catholics and so on like that. Moral injury is an injury to the soul. Mm-hmm. It injures your soul. It's inside there, different to PTSD, post-traumatic stress in that regard. And that explained it to me. The penny dropped when I heard that, because at that time in Ireland, 1961, most Irish families would kneel down at night to say the rosary after their evening meal or before the kids would do the homework, and in that kind of context, it's easy to see where moral injury might have started affecting the guys. And they became silent. And my own father, he never spoke. He spoke a lot about the battle. And when I became an army captain later on and a ranger and so on, then he started explaining to me the tactics, etc. But he never once explained to me about the bad side, the moral injury side. He didn't know the term moral injury, but he was hurting. I could see he was hurting. He was silent about that aspect of it. And I discovered in the last 4 or 5 years when this thing all came out about the others, they never spoke either.
Yeah.
So in any event, my father, for example, 2 years before he died, he told one of my brothers, he said, the only thing I regret about Jadotville, he said, is those 2 men I murdered, not killed in battle, murdered. Because it was eating away at him for many, many years, that he had to do something that went against his moral fiber, his religious beliefs, because, and I suppose instinctively, he knew that they weren't out there to kill people, they were out to help people. And that bothered him. Maybe not at the time, he had to do it, and so on and so forth. But when he was thinking about it later on, I know it bothered him. Now, we never saw it in the family. He was a great dad. Other dads that I've heard of, they became a bit weird and a bit violent and so on. But in our case, we're very lucky with Dad. He was never like that. But it hurt him, and he kept it within himself. Since then, I've discovered that many other veterans were the same. Really powerful men that I served with, sergeants, company sergeants, sergeant majors later on. They were powerfully strong men. But now I've discovered from their families, yes, my dad is very silent. Some people say my dad used to go down to the garden shed and spoke on his own for hours. My dad never gave me a hug after Jadotville. One man said I could never tell my wife I loved her after Jadotville, even though they were very happy and still happy. I know that. So you had that kind of a scenario.
Yeah, because the ripple effects just aren't affecting that soldier or that veteran. It spreads into the family, and that then can spread into the wider community as well, because how that child can grow up and develop with adverse childhood experiences, not getting that necessary love and attention from the parents, because they're having to deal with all these other emotions and what else is going on. So it's like the parent doing their best to protect that child, but at the same time they're being absent for giving that child what that child may need at that time.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. If you don't mind, I'm going to expand on that slightly, Rich, because as you were talking, Leo, what occurred to me was that in a way, with Jadotville, because it was a peacekeeping mission, there's no anticipation. You're there to prevent the loss of life.
Yes.
You're there to prevent the conflict, and all of a sudden you're right in the middle of it, fighting for your life, doing the very thing you thought you were there to prevent. And if you think about the concept of an injury of the soul, and that sort of expression of love with your family, with your partner afterwards, if you feel as though there's a taint or a stain on your soul, damage to your soul, then from a, I suppose if you think about it from a more spiritual side, it's almost kind of like, do you want to pass that taint on? It's like, if I feel this, my soul is now in some way unclean or fractured or hurt or damaged, do I want to bring that into contact with those I love? Do I want to touch them with that soul?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Ali, because at that time, as I said, we're all kneeling down saying our prayers at night. But in the messages that were sent home from the Congo, and I have them on tape, when there were prisoners of war, the sons and fathers sending messages home to the families, they'd always say, listen, pray for us, God bless you, we're praying for you every night. So that was very much part of the makeup of the individual soldiers. And they had mass every morning out there, because I had a chaplain with the company in the battle. And every morning they had mass at 7:30 in the morning or 7 o'clock, something like that. So it did hurt them in the soul. And then when they were ignored with no duty of care, they start saying to themselves, some of them, what did we do wrong? some of them began to feel ashamed or said, we must have done something wrong, we're being ignored. I remember the company sergeant, who was later a sergeant major, powerful man, and man I admired very much. And when I was a young captain, he kept me on the straight and narrow, I remember him saying years later, when he was, 89, he said, we did nothing to be ashamed of. We did nothing. So he went silent, but he didn't suffer. My dad didn't suffer as much as other people. Other people went quite crazy. There's a story of one man who became very, very violent. And as his wife said, they sent the wrong man home to me. They sent a different man home. And he became violent and so on. And the wife tried to kill the children, murder-suicide on 2-3 occasions, failed it. The gas didn't work in the house, so they set the house on fire, but the kids got out in time. Eventually, she took her own life. That's just one. There's another story of this 17-year-old boy, although his daughter, now a grandmother, told me he was actually only 16. His brother told me he was 17. The paper said he was 19, but like 1959, 60, 61, many of them lied about their ages just to get a job. The Hungry 50s, as it was called in Ireland. So he was just coming up to 17 when he did a very heroic thing, saving the lives of the pilot and co-pilot, running out under fire to rescue them when the helicopter landed, as is seen in the film and so on. And he was recommended for the MMG, Military Medal for Gallantry, which is like your Victoria Cross. He never got it. He didn't even know he was recommended for it. Headed off to South Africa, got married, then to New Zealand, and his wife is still alive. And I'm allowed to tell you these things because they've already told me this on our podcast. And, when he'd come in, his wife would know, it's going to be a bad evening, fisticuffs and things like that. So she'd send the kids out. One of the daughters told me that he tried to kill us one time at the pistol. We ran out into the back garden and escaped from shooting at us with that 36 Webley. She knew the weapon. And his wife said to me about a year ago, she said, he's dead now for many years. And she said, to this day, I still love him madly. And the people I'm talking about, none of them ever heard of moral injury until, I suppose, I brought it up about 2.5 years ago. And to use the expression we always use, with them, all of a sudden the penny dropped. That's what was wrong with my dad. Now I know. Now I can understand better. He must have been a very good soldier. He went through all of this thing and he suffered badly because of it. Now I understand. And now I can forgive him. And now I've got closure. And I suppose this epitomizes what we're trying to do with our podcast, Moral Injury International, is to raise the awareness of moral injury, where people might be able to recognize, that's why my father was like this, or that's why I was like this. And I have some closure to the whole thing. Mm-hmm. So, that's kind of the layman's way of looking at it.
Yeah, because we've been talking to Paul Grace, and his grandfather was in Operation Hurricane, and he was a pilot out there. And when he's older, Paul managed to talk to his grandfather about what happened and all that sort of stuff. So he wrote a book, Operation Hurricane, and that's all about the moral injury that the British nuclear testing veterans had suffered. And as well is, my guess would be the inhabitants of Western Australia as well, because they weren't necessarily told the truth to the extent of what happened in that area, the radiation fallout and all that sort of stuff. So as you were saying earlier, Leo, the denial and the lack of awareness or the lack of giving recognition to people who had served and all their families about what's gone through greatly affects deeply across all sorts of boundaries.
It's righteous outrage, isn't it? Mm-hmm. At the unfairness of it.
Yes. It's not unique to any one country, no. This lack of duty of care to returning soldiers. Mm-hmm. It happens in every country. It happens in the American Army big time. It happens in the Australian Army. Yeah. I'm told by one of our podcasters It happens in the Irish Army. It happens everywhere. And not just in military. We've been talking military now. We got the same story from Dallas, Texas, from the police force in Dallas, Texas. We're getting it from people in the Aborigine community. We're getting it everywhere. So it's just, I suppose, in a nutshell, from the authorities who've got the power to do things, they don't do it. There's a great lack of what we call duty of care to people returning, particularly youngsters. And the transgenerational effect is what's horrifying, quite frankly. It's going down. I know children of Jadotville who don't speak to each other because of the way their dad was when they came home. Now, I have to admit, in I served with quite a few of the Jadotville soldiers afterwards, because I was 16 at the time, like some of them. And later on, when I was a captain, some of my NCOs and some of the people I worked with were only the same age or 2 or 3 years older than me. Some of them, they didn't seem to have much of a problem. So if you think of a perimeter defensive situation, maybe some of them didn't see as much as the others saw, or didn't kill as many as the others. And some people may be stronger mentally than others. So I can't say that right throughout the 155 men that each band suffered the same way, but the majority of them did.
Is that maybe about being able to rationalise the responsibility in terms of those actions, and to be able to say, actually, no, I wasn't responsible for that, so therefore I am clean of the blame of that?
Yeah, I would say so.
As opposed to, I've done something that goes against my values and my beliefs that I shouldn't have had to do, and then because that was through the actions or the non-actions of someone else, I now have to bear this, and they don't acknowledge it.
Yeah, well, just what you said laterally just now, your last couple of sentences, that probably explains it better. You know, the lack of or inaction or too much of the wrong decisions at higher level caused me to be put in that situation. Consequently, I'm suffering. You know, that's it in a nutshell, really.
Yes. There's also potentially as well, Leo, is because obviously Ireland is quite Catholic, and you've got the 10 Commandments and thou shalt not kill.
Yeah.
And so there's that contradiction as well of having to go out into UN peacekeeping operation, essentially. And they've had to end up killing 300 odd men and injuring them as well.
Yes. Okay, well, there's a way of looking at that. As my father said in a letter to my mother, you know, we should not have had to kill any Africans. We came to help them. And he did say, he said, if we were fighting for Ireland, it would have been a different thing. We'd have fought, and that's it. But my dad was an intelligent man. He understood the political situation, the world situation at the macro level, and now down at the micro level on the battlefield. He did what had to be done on the battlefield, and all his men came home alive, which is the biggest achievement of everything, out of all this fiasco. But he understood the macro and micro level. He didn't like the micro level, but he did a very good job at it. But it harmed him and others afterwards because it was so effective with what they did. And then to be discarded afterwards and ignored, that was a double whammy. We talk about the double whammy. The first wham is the battle, what they had to do. The second whammy is when they were ignored by higher authority and betrayed by higher authority. Then the moral injuries set in, and it festered and festered and festered until the day they died.
Or maybe it's two separate moral injuries that then combine to create a bigger hurt. It's almost like layers of moral injury that gradually accumulate. Because what was interesting, Rich and I were talking about this before we came on. It's a hot topic, is moral injury between the two of us. And we were talking about the ripple impact. Because I know there's, as Rich said earlier, there's that impact in terms of ACEs, you know, that gap and distance, that the impact of coping mechanisms which have an unintended harm as a result. But there's also that community impact. And we were debating the nature of almost like vicarious moral injury. New moral injury by association or appreciation of somebody else's injury and recognition that this is wrong also, which also triggers an injury. And what was interesting for us was the community impact of Jadotville
Yeah.
that you told us about?
Yes, well, it's a good point you've raised there about the community impact. There's pluses and minuses in this. One of the plus sides, and I'm thinking of one particular place in Athlone, the town where most of the soldiers came from, or at least the town where most of the soldiers were stationed. In one particular street, there were 13 soldiers from those maybe 70 houses, 30 soldiers in Jadotville, 13 soldiers in Jadotville. But for nearly 2 generations after Jadotville, they're still very close and united. And I think they helped each other, as the years went on. And I know these people because they were all corporals and sergeants, private soldiers. And I, at the age of 15 and 16, I played basketball with their children. And later on, their children were in the army when I was in the army. So to some extent, I kind of know what they went through. But the community, they helped each other.
Mm.
In other communities, military communities, the Jadotville people were to some extent ostracized because the word got around, oh, you didn't do such a good job. You didn't, because you didn't get the medals, they thought they did something wrong. And then going to further where these soldiers left and they went back to their hometown and they were on their own. There were very few veterans around anywhere, and they had to live with it silently.
Mm. Yeah.
And so you had look. There's so many layers, and so many layers of effect on individuals.
As you're saying, Leo, that support network was probably vital in them moving on from what they were experiencing and helping deal with that because of those experiences. And over here now, we've got the Armed Forces and Veterans Breakfast Clubs, and the equivalent thereof. And they provide that support, that chat, that commonality that people are sharing. So that helps people move on from what they're doing, maybe look at things in a different way and have that common bond with each other.
Yes. Yes. And I noticed about when you mentioned that, they didn't meet together in Jadotville just to talk about Jadotville. Just the very fact that they'd meet was just enough, I think. Yeah. And they never probably put it into words of moral injury because they didn't know about it until 2 or 3 years ago. But I do know that, as you know yourself, and the same in the police force or in hospitals, there's a kind of a bond between all the workers or all the soldiers and all the policemen that transcends their job and they meet socially afterwards. But for years afterwards, Jadotville, my father was cutting turf. I think you call it peat, but cutting turf for his fire in his own bog. And some of his soldiers from Jadotville used to cut the turf with him and save it with them and bring it back and stack it in our garage near the house. So we'd have it for the winter. And my mother would have a nice dinner ready for them and probably a glass of whiskey each and so on. And that camaraderie lasted for the rest of their lives. And that would have had a healing effect as well. The very fact that here you had people who were in the same thing and are still friends for years afterwards.
I suppose that's almost the wrapping round of community, isn't it? The collective acceptance of community, which in a way starts to heal that fractured sense of self, that fractured sense of worth, the fractured sense of value, because the community says, no, you are valued.
Mm.
Yeah, but sorry.
I was going to say, and there's also, with that, there's no judgment on that person as well.
Correct. The sense of value, Ali, you mentioned that. This is an area that we're thinking about in moral injury, because other people have said the same thing, that some of the men who came back from Jadotville and other such places like that, and police forces and everything else, if they're being ignored by the bosses that are in a position of power and authority, whom you should look up to and respect, if these people don't treat you the way you think you should be treated, you automatically lose your sense of value, or it might be in somehow or other impinged upon, and you'd be questioning it. And that does set in as well, which just adds to the trauma of moral injury.
Well, I know when I've worked with it, I think one of the recurring themes that you see a lot in military is the sense of the gift of service. that you are in service to your country.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that there's a value to that gift, because fundamentally that means I'm prepared to die for you.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you've got the command structure that then doesn't fulfill their part of the equation, that duty of care, what does it say about how much value they place on the gift you have given?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But that's not unusual. It's been there for generations like that. Soldiers thrown on a scrap heap afterwards. When you think in the United States, I hope I'm correct when I say this, around 2022, October 22, when I was over in the United States giving the talk on Jadotville and talking about moral injury and working with US Army veterans, they told me that the 40 US veterans per day were taking their own lives. That's a battalion every month.
Mm.
And in the previous 20 years, something like 75,000 veterans had taken their own lives. And the more than had been killed in any battles in that same 20 years.
Yeah.
And this is horrific when you think of those numbers. And they put it down to lack of duty of care, lack of interest. They cannot get their authorities to take care of these veterans. They have many things that do take care of the veteran, but it's not enough. And it's the same in many armies, the same in many places in the world, not just in military situations.
Well, what I was going to add to that, Leo, was if somebody's gone on and working for an organisation, they've been kind of left at a scrap heap, there's that psychological safety. Can you trust these people to do the right thing for you and help you out when you're needed? So if you've got a manager and they tell you wherever it is, and it goes against what you're doing, it goes against your morals and values, and you're expecting them to do their care of duty towards you, there's that psychological safety in going, I can't trust this individual, I can't trust that person. That then can spread into the rest of the structure of that organisation. And that would then be generalised as in, I'm not trusting the rest of these people. I can't cope with this.
Yeah. Yes, well, that would be an obvious side effect, an obvious result of what you've said. Yes, it's a difficult one. One of the things that we're hoping about Moral Injury International, that when what we're doing and the message we're sending out, it might trigger in the authorities' minds that, hey, if we're sending people into harm's way, we have to anticipate that they're going to need some duty of care afterwards, depending on the circumstances they find themselves. And we're hoping that this will maybe add another, let's say, box to be ticked before they send people into harm's way, so that they'll be ready for them when they come back. I do know that in the Irish Army, in a place we mentioned earlier, Kosovo, where we both were maybe around the same time, I do know that, because I met them on flights, they were sending officers and NCOs who were skilled and trained in identifying post-traumatic stress. They were sending them out to talk to the troops while they were on the ground, and just conversations with them. And they might say, that guy is suffering from something, let's talk to him and bring him home if necessary. So they were taking an interest in it. So we're hoping that they'll add moral injury to that list of things to be taken care of in advance, or to be aware of in advance.
So what they brought into the British Army is something called TRIM. And I can't remember what the name of it, what the acronym stands for now, but that was started by a guy called, he ended up as Lieutenant Colonel Richard Dorney. He was in the Grenadiers, and he then, I think, got his master's in psychiatry. So he founded this TRIM training, which, again, as you were saying, looks at the psychological evaluation of how is that soldier performing, and they brought it into prison service and other various organisations as well.
It needs to be done. It really needs to be done. And when you think about it, so many things happening in the world at the moment. God help us, what the Russian soldiers, individual soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, Israeli soldiers, not to mention the poor Palestinians, what are they going to be suffering from in the years to come? You know, it's going to go on for generations, this suffering.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I've probably raised this in a previous podcast, but I think it's pertinent to raise it again here. And that's the nature of the injury can be significantly different. The nature of the event can be significantly different, because often it's not actually the point of injury may not actually be the actions themselves, but the point of realization, which may come hours, days, weeks, months, years later, that this is now, you're now in moral conflict with yourself.
Yes.
And so, for instance, you could argue that the withdrawal from Afghanistan for a lot of people was a moral injury, because that and how that happened really called into question the value of that service again, and the value of that effort and the endeavour, and the losses and the injuries that went with that to achieve that. And that then means that the event itself is separate from what people would argue traditionally would be the point of contact, the point of combat and interaction. The moral injury itself occurs at a different stage because of the nature of, I suppose, the inflicting wound and how that wound is inflicted.
Yes, there's lots of what you say there. Just when you're talking, something triggered in my mind. You know, when you hear about people suffering some trauma, whether it be a sexual attack or something, they deny it for years. And it comes back to them in their 50s, 40s and 50s, or when they have time to think, or when their career is nearly over, then all of a sudden it hits them. So I'm quite sure that in the military sense of what we're talking about, people might just continue with their jobs in the army and stay there until they're 60 years of age in the army. And then when they retire, then all of a sudden the thing sets in. It'll come at different stages to different people.
Yeah. Well, we were talking with a Dr. Kim Bond, and she's part of an organisation called NAPAC, and they help adults who've experienced adverse childhood experiences. And the average time for them to get a disclosure is 20 years after the event or thereabouts.
Wow.
So, yeah, you're quite right in saying there's that lack of acknowledgement and that realisation going, oh, something wasn't right. How can I help? How can I deal with this now?
Yes. Well, I mean, in the case of Jadotville, we did say off camera talking yesterday, I think, you had some reactions that were very quick. Like, I mean, one young man, 18 years of age, took his own life 2 years later in London. And I'm speaking with his brother, who was only 9 years of age at the time. And his brother has suffered psychologically and mentally ever since. And he's now 70-ish, right? And he's still suffering. And then there's the other man, Matt Quinlan, no relation to us, although I'd love if he was closely related, lovely family. 16 years of age, did an amazingly brave thing in Jadotville. Himself and two 16-year-olds and a 17-year-old in a mortar trench. They were only young boys. And they did brave things. And he was recommended for a Distinguished Service Medal and promotion of corporal, fit to stay in the army, left immediately after Jadotville, headed off to Australia, never ever came home again, never had any relationship that lasted in Australia, saved an Aborigine child from drowning, was taken in by the local community. They put up a monument to him in Winton in Australia, Queensland. But unfortunately, some years back, he took a gun to his head and ended his life. And I can give you other examples, but these are the kind of things suffering from moral injury, But
that split of your soul, isn't it? That split of your identity, of who you feel you are.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, in our way, we're kind of, as I said earlier, we're boots in the mud. We're talking about moral injury from our own experiences of observing it or suffering from it. And we're interviewing people who have had serious problems with moral injury. And in our layman way, we're just trying to raise the awareness of moral injury so that people will say, that's my dad, or that's why my brother's like that. Oh, this explains my granddad. Yeah. Now I can understand better. Mm-hmm. as I said earlier, now I forgive him. Now I understand. Now I've got closure.
I think a lot of that comes with a sense of relief in a way sometimes, because I know that certainly when I'm working with somebody, whether quite a lot of that is almost doing what we're doing here, is talking about something in real terms, not talking about it in scientific jargon or medicalese, but talking about it in the terms of the context of their experience.
Yeah.
And that point of understanding sometimes also has a healing impact, because it means that you now have a reason for why you're feeling all these things. You have a context for it. You can have a placement for it that starts to allow maybe a little bit of separation from it to go, okay, now I understand.
Yeah. Now, you use the word understanding, Ali, and I think this is the key word, understanding. We've discovered that when the people that we're talking to understand what moral injury is, the penny drops, as I said many times. All of a sudden, they can understand their father or their uncle or their brother. Now, I know families who are split because of the dad as a result of Jadotville. Some of them don't want to hear anything about moral injury. No, he was, excuse my expression, he was a bastard. The others say, no, but look what he went through. And look, I forgive him. And I'm happier because I understand my dad now. I understand what happened to him. I understand why he was like he was. And he was a victim. He was a victim. And it wasn't his fault. So now I'm much more relaxed about life as a result. Whereas another brother in the same family, he's holding everything inside himself. He's suffering from moral injury and he doesn't even realize it.
Yeah.
Well, that's
where we're coming from.
Yeah. And so as we were talking off screen beforehand, we mentioned about your art and how therapeutic that is just to be present in that moment.
Yeah.
And
when I was at what age, in my late 30s, I remember I bought an art set for one of my daughters. I have 3 daughters and 5 sons. So in other words, I have 4 bosses at home. So one of my daughters bought her an art set for Christmas and she never used it. So come February, I took it up and I started painting by numbers. And I all of a sudden, I just like the feel of it. So I started painting in my late 30s for about 3 years, gave it up because I was traveling all around the world. And about 10 years ago in Sarajevo, the group of people I was working with, some of them were artists, and so would you like to come along to one of our evening sessions? And I went along, bought some pastels, and I did 2 paintings that night, which I framed in my own house because all of a sudden it came back to me. So for the last 10 years or so, I've been painting fairly regularly, and thank God. God is good to me. I'm successful enough with it, and I have my own art gallery in the southwest of Kerry and southwest of Ireland, County Kerry. And it's very therapeutic. It's totally therapeutic to me. It's not a job of work. It's a job of love. And I enjoy doing it, and it's relaxing. And, thoughts come into your mind, but the nice thoughts, and helps creativity anyway. Well, whatever. It's good for me. Yeah. It's good for me.
It's essentially, I guess, it's about that presence and being centered with yourself, because if you put a brush stroke wrong, you'll be like, bugger. Yeah. You'd be annoyed with yourself rather than going, but we mentioned creativity before. There's something, if you're creative, and everybody's creative, if you can do something nice, even if nobody else likes it, if you like it, you're comfortable with it, it's good for the soul. It's good for the soul.
Well, that comes with the definition of good enough, doesn't it? And sometimes we think that that's determined by other people, and we forget that actually it's determined by ourselves.
Yeah.
And that means that you don't have to be Van Gogh or Monet to enjoy and be good at art, because it's about how you choose to express that. It's how you choose to use your words, whether that's written, whether that's music, whether that's canvas and paint and charcoals. It doesn't really matter. It's about your expression. That's all that matters.
That's true. Well, I agree with you there, but at the same time, I'm kind of happy that other people like my stuff and they pay me a lot of money.
I'll give you that.
You know,
Yeah.
that helps as well. You know. But certainly, I would advise anybody to, particularly in retirement, I would advise everybody to have some reason to get up in the morning, whether it's playing golf or whatever it is, or some kind of an art or craft or something. Do it, because it's very therapeutic, good for the soul. Good for the soul.
And I think with the word moral injury, it's got the injury on the end of it. So there's some form of process of being able to heal from that as well.
Correct. That's what we're trying to do with Moral Injury International. What you're trying to do. The healing process, I've explained it a few times there. Oh, the penny drop. Yes, now I understand. That's a healing process. And, you know, we've had people coming on saying, I've watched your podcast. Now I understand it. Now I feel a bit more comfortable. And now I can sleep a little bit better. You know, so without being experts in it, we're doing a little bit towards the healing process.
Well, it just strikes me that we talk about the neuroplasticity of the brain, the flexibility, but there's also flexibility of identity and who we see ourselves as. Otherwise, we'd never change. And that also means that injury to the soul, to the sense of identity, the sense of who we are, also has the potential to be the starts of building something new, the starts of shaping something new, because it can be shaped. We can shape our sense of identity. Yeah. And that means that there's always room for healing there.
Well, one would like to think there's room for healing. And I do believe so. I do believe so, you know.
So if you were to give a key takeaway from today, Leo, what do you think you would like everybody to carry with them in terms of the conversations we've had? What's important for you, the messages that they have?
Oh, a message to people, is it?
Yeah, just things that you want them to keep in mind and remember when they think about our conversation today.
Yeah. Well, I suppose if anybody's interested in, let's say, the results of trauma that somebody belonged to them might have been involved in, whether it be military or otherwise, just to pause a little bit and think of the moral injury factor and say, I wonder now, is my husband, wife, brother, sister, child, what they've been through, is moral injury a factor? And if it is, bear in mind that it exists, and if they identify it, that's half of the battle, and they'll be able to help that person just simply by talking. Simply by talking. That's what we've discovered. Or if somebody themselves should say, there's something wrong with me, what the hell is it? And say, oh, this moral injury thing is, I wonder if, you know, am I affected by that? Well, just to think about it. Think about it, read about it, and maybe watch some podcasts about it. That's about the only advice I could give.
I think somebody's understanding, as I said earlier, is a massive step forward in recovery and healing.
Yes. We've had a number of examples. That's what keeps us going, because we get a phone call from somebody, oh, listen, I've watched your podcast or whatever, and penny dropped from me. Now I understand. Oh, we feel great for this. This is another person that we've helped. And that sounds, I hope it doesn't sound too something or other. We feel fairly humble about what we're doing. To some extent, we can hardly believe that we're getting to people. And our only aim is just to raise the awareness of moral injury. And, we're self-funding. We're doing it without anybody's help, and so on and so forth. And we're just getting a big kick out of it because we know what it is ourselves from our own family situation. Mm-hmm. And that's what's driving us, I suppose. Mm-hmm. What's driving you as well, I imagine, what you're doing, you know.
Yeah. So thank you, Leo.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your time.
It's my pleasure, and thank you for...
Yeah. And what we'll do is we'll add your links to your moral injury International, your podcast, and
Okay.
obviously to your art gallery as well, so people can have a look at your amazing art.
And it is amazing.
Okay.
And
Appreciate
thank
that.
you very much for your time, Leo.
Thank
It's
you.
been a pleasure having the conversation.
Let's keep in touch.
Definitely.
Definitely. Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.
And God bless you. God bless you.
Take care. Bye-bye.